If you look at a classic circus act, there is always that one performer who just makes everyone in the audience hold their breath.
Oh, absolutely. The tightrope walker.
Exactly. They are up there balancing on this impossibly thin wire, holding that long pole to just, keep their center of gravity absolutely perfect.
Right, because if they lean even a fraction of an inch too far to the left or the right, it is just a complete disaster.
It's a brilliant image of like high-stakes equilibrium.
It really is. When you are on that wire, you are entirely focused on staying upright, right? On preserving stability above literally everything else.
But now, imagine that same tightrope walker suspended high up in the air, and we are going to walk over and hand them 3 flaming torches.
Oh, wow. So they have to juggle while balancing.
Exactly. So now they have to maintain that perfect life-or-death balance on the wire while simultaneously executing this complex juggling routine. And that, in a nutshell, is the modern central bank.
That is a very stressful visual.
Right. The wire, the balance, is price stability. And the juggling act, that is economic growth.
And the stakes of that performance are, the livelihoods of over 1 billion people.
Yeah.
If you drop the torches, the economy stagnates. Businesses cannot expand, jobs are not created, and progress basically stalls.
But if you lose your balance on the wire while trying to catch a torch,
The whole economy crashes into runaway inflation.
Exactly.
Exactly. It is a terrifying, magnificent balancing act, and it requires an incredible array of tools to pull off.
which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are taking a massive, comprehensive look at the Reserve Bank of India's monetary policy framework.
It's a huge topic.
It is. Our stack of sources today zeroes in exclusively on Chapter 3 of the RBI's Functions and Working Manual, and we're also culling in some essential mechanics from Chapter 4 on market operations as well.
Right, which is crucial context.
We know many of you listening are gearing up for a major promotional exam, or perhaps you just want a masterclass in macroeconomic mechanics.
And it truly is a masterclass. This material is often presented as a dry list of ratios and acronyms.
So many acronyms.
So many. But behind every one of those acronyms is a moment of economic crisis, or a structural shift in the global economy, or just a desperate need to fix a broken system.
So our goal today is to give you such a nuanced, layered understanding of this material that you will not even need to crack open Chapter 3 yourself.
We are going to do the heavy lifting for you.
We're going to internalize the logic, the history, and the mechanics of the RBI's framework so deeply that the answers will just make intuitive sense. Consider this your ultimate immersive audio study session.
And understanding the why is really the only way to master this.
Yeah, rote memorization will definitely fail you when the questions get complex on the exam.
Exactly. If you understand the fundamental problem a central bank is trying to solve at any given moment in history, the specific tool they invent to solve it becomes completely logical.
Let's start from the very foundation then. If we go all the way back to the original 1934 RBI Act, the mandate was, well, relatively straightforward.
It was very different back then.
The text essentially said the bank was to regulate the issue of banknotes and keep reserves to secure monetary stability. It sounds so simple compared to what they do today.
It does, but it was a product of a very different era.
Right.
The global financial system was way less interconnected, and India's domestic economy was not the sprawling, dynamic engine it is now.
Yeah, so what were they actually focusing on with that simple mandate?
The focus back then was primarily on preserving the purchasing power of the currency. They basically wanted to ensure that the money in a citizen's pocket meant the same thing tomorrow as it did today.
Makes sense.
But as the Indian economy modernized, liberalized, and just deeply integrated with global financial markets, that simple, almost passive mandate became completely inadequate.
Fast forward to the modern era. If there's one date that completely redefined modern banking in India, it is May 2016.
Oh, absolutely. A massive turning point.
The RBI Act received a huge amendment. This wasn't just a tiny tweak to the rules, right? It was a philosophical overhaul.
It was a watershed moment in Indian economic history. The May 2016 amendment explicitly defined the primary objective of monetary policy.
And what exactly does the law say now?
It states that the primary objective is to maintain price stability while keeping in mind the objective of growth.
Which brings us right back to our tightrope walker juggling the flaming torches.
Exactly. Price stability is the balance. Growth is the juggling.
But I have to play devil's advocate here. In an emerging economy like India, where, lifting millions out of poverty is paramount, why does price stability get the primary billing?
That is a very common question.
Like, why not legally mandate the RBI to maximize growth while keeping in mind price stability? Why prioritize the wire over the torches?
That is the core debate of central banking. And it really comes down to a harsh economic reality. Inflation is a deeply regressive tax.
A regressive tax, what do you mean by that?
It means it disproportionately devastates the poorest segments of society.
Ah, I see.
The wealthy have assets, right? Real estate, equities, gold, things that tend to rise in value along with inflation. They have a hedge.
And a wage earner does not.
Exactly. If the cost of food and fuel doubles, their standard of living is instantly destroyed. They don't have stock portfolios to offset the cost of groceries.
So it's essentially a hierarchy of needs. You can't build a growing economy on a foundation of rapidly eroding purchasing power.
Precisely. If prices are spiraling out of control, businesses cannot plan for the future. I mean, you wouldn't build a new factory if you have no idea what steel will cost next month.
Right. And what about foreign investment?
Foreign investors flee because their returns are eaten alive by currency depreciation. High volatile inflation destroys the very bedrock required for sustainable growth.
So the legislature, through that 2016 amendment, made it legally unambiguous.
Yes, your first job, your primary job is the tightrope, price stability. Only when that stability is secure can you worry about the juggling act of growth. But the RBI didn't just wake up in 2016 with this perfect, laser-focused framework. To truly grasp the brilliance of the current system, we have to look at the spectacular failures and the structural traps of the past.
We definitely do. The evolution of this framework is essentially a story of the RBI constantly being forced to adapt as the Indian economy outgrew its old clothes.
And those old clothes were very rigid. Let's look at the era before the mid-1980s.
Right, the pre-1985 era.
The RBI didn't really use markets to manage the economy in the way we understand it today, did they?
No, not at all. Monetary policy was largely about direct controls and credit budgeting.
Let's paint a picture of that for the listener. What does a banking system operating on credit budgeting actually look like for, say, a business owner?
It looks like an administrative labyrinth. The RBI would essentially mandate exactly where credit should go, to which sectors, and at what specific interest rates.
So they were micromanaging the money.
Absolutely. It was a command and control approach,
Right.
heavily suited to an economy where the government played a dominant role in allocating all resources.
So if you were a business owner,
You didn't just go to a bank and negotiate a rate based on your creditworthiness. You had to fit into a pre-approved sectoral bucket.
it sounds incredibly blunt, like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer.
That's a good way to put it.
As the economy grew, that rigid, administered approach started to crack. It simply couldn't keep up with the complexity of a diversifying nation.
And that friction leads us directly to the first major paradigm shift.
Right. The year is 1985, and the government forms the Chakravarti Committee.
Yes, the Committee to Review the Working of the Monetary System, chaired by the eminent economist Dr. Sukamoy Chakravarti.
What did they find?
They looked at the creaking system of direct controls and realized it was becoming hopelessly inefficient. So they recommended a massive pivot to a framework called monetary targeting.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of monetary targeting, because this is definitely exam material. Right. For anyone trying to conceptualize this, there are two key terms to master, right?
Correct. You need to understand the intermediate target and the operating instrument.
Okay, let's start with the intermediate target. What is that?
Think of the RBI trying to drive a massive ship. The ultimate destination is stable inflation and good growth.
Right.
But you can't just steer directly toward growth. You need a compass heading to guide your daily actions.
And in this framework, what was that compass heading?
The intermediate target was broad money, universally known as M3.
Broad money. Okay, let's define the ingredients of M3.
It is essentially the total supply of money sloshing around in the economy.
So it includes the physical currency in the hands of the public, right?
Yes. Plus the demand deposits in banks like your checking account that you can withdraw at any time.
And time deposits, too.
Exactly. Plus the time deposits, like fixed deposits, held within the banking system.
So what was the underlying economic theory here? Why target M3?
The theory is monetarism. The belief was that inflation is fundamentally a monetary phenomenon.
Meaning too much money chasing too few goods.
Exactly. If you can tightly control the growth of broad money, ensuring it only grows just enough to support real economic activity, you can keep inflation perfectly in check.
So M3 is the compass heading. But the RBI can't just, press a button on a computer and magically set the exact amount of M3 in the economy.
Yeah, they cannot.
They need a steering wheel. They need a lever they can physically pull on a daily basis.
And that lever is the operating instrument. Under the Chakravarti framework, the operating instrument was reserve money, often called M0 or base money.
Reserve money, how is that different from M3?
Reserve money is the high-powered money created directly by the central bank. It is the physical currency in circulation, plus the deposits that commercial banks are legally required to hold with the RBI.
Ah, I see the mechanical linkage now. The RBI controls reserve money directly,
Right.
and by tweaking the amount of reserve money, they aim to influence the broader M3 through the money multiplier effect.
That is the exact mechanism. When the RBI injects 100 rupees of reserve money into a bank, the bank keeps a fraction in reserve and lends the rest out.
And then that loan becomes a deposit in another bank.
Exactly. And that second bank keeps a fraction and lends the rest out. So that single 100 rupee injection multiplies into a much larger expansion of broad money, or M3.
So the overarching strategy was highly mathematical,
Yeah.
almost like an engineering equation.
It was very systematic.
The central bank would project the expected real GDP growth for the coming year, decide on what level of inflation was tolerable, and then calculate exactly how much M3 needed to grow to facilitate that.
Yes, and then they would adjust their steering wheel reserve money to hit that M3 target.
On paper, it sounds elegant, precise, and completely rational.
On paper, it does.
But it failed spectacularly. It collapsed due to a structural flaw that the sources identify as fiscal dominance.
A very crucial concept.
Why did this elegant mathematical targeting fall apart in reality? What went wrong?
It collapsed because the RBI realized they didn't actually have control over their own steering wheel.
Oh, so?
During this era, the RBI lacked control over its credit to the central government. You see, the government was running massive chronic fiscal deficits.
So they were spending way more money on subsidies, infrastructure, and administration than they were actually taking in through taxes.
Exactly.
Okay, if I spend more than I earn, I have to go to a bank and ask for a loan, and the bank might just say no. How did the government finance this massive deficit?
By forcing the RBI to monetize the debt through a mechanism called ad hoc treasury bills.
And this wasn't a negotiation, was it?
Not at all. When the central government's cash balances at the RBI fell below a certain minimum threshold, these ad hoc treasury bills were automatically created.
Automatically.
Yes, the RBI was legally obligated to absorb them, which meant the RBI had to literally print new reserve money to hand over to the government.
Okay, I have an analogy for this. Imagine monetary targeting is like trying to stick to a strict, precise calorie counting diet.
Okay, I like where this is going.
You are the RBI, carefully calculating exactly how many calories, reserve money, you need to consume to hit your target weight, which is M3. You have your meals planned perfectly.
Right.
But your roommate is the central government. And every single night, your roommate busts into your room and forces you to eat 3 giant pizzas.
Oh.
Those pizzas are the ad hoc treasury bill.
That is a remarkably accurate and deeply tragic analogy.
Right.
The RBI was desperately trying to restrict the money supply to keep inflation down, but the government effectively had a blank check drawn on the central bank's printing press.
So every time the government needed cash, the pizzas were delivered.
Exactly. And the RBI was forced to inject massive amounts of reserve money into the system. This completely blew up the RBI's carefully calculated M3 targets.
So the monetary policy was entirely subservient to the fiscal policy, hence the term fiscal dominance. The RBI is just trapped in a basement, watching inflation rise, endlessly force-feeding itself treasury bills because the government can't balance its budget. How did the Indian economy ever escape this trap?
The escape route was born out of crisis. By the early 1990s, this relentless automatic monetization of debt had severely damaged macroeconomic stability.
This led to the 1991 crisis, right?
Yes, culminating in the historic 1991 balance of payments crisis. The government and the RBI recognized that if they didn't fundamentally change the plumbing of how the government funded itself, the economy would just collapse.
Which triggers the historic economic and financial sector reforms of the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
This is a massive transitional period.
It was a complete overhaul.
What were the specific actions taken to break this cycle of fiscal dominance?
They initiated a deliberate shift toward market-determined interest rates and market-based financing for the government.
Okay.
The most critical step, the absolute game changer, was an agreement between the RBI and the government to phase out those ad hoc treasury bills entirely by 1997.
They just got rid of them.
Yes. They replaced them with a system of ways and means advances, which is strictly a temporary facility for short-term mismatches, not a permanent funding source.
So the government could no longer just force the RBI to print money on demand. The pizza deliveries stopped.
The pizza stopped.
If the government wanted to borrow money, they had to go to the open market and convince investors to buy their bonds at market-determined interest rates.
Exactly. It instilled immense fiscal discipline. And alongside this, the RBI began regaining control over its own tools.
What did they do?
Well, in 1997, they reactivated the bank rate, using it as a signaling rate to communicate their monetary policy stance to the newly liberalized markets.
And there was a third major reform during this 1990s period that drastically altered the banking landscape.
Yeah.
The massive reduction of statutory preemptions.
This is deeply tied to fiscal dominance. During the bad old days, the government didn't just force the RBI to buy its debt, it forced commercial banks to buy it too. They kept the statutory liquidity ratio, the SLR, incredibly high. Banks were legally forced to park a huge chunk of their deposits in government bonds.
Wow.
Furthermore, the RBI kept the cash reserve ratio, the CRR, extraordinarily high simply to try and absorb all the excess liquidity those ad hoc bills were creating.
It sounds like banks weren't actually in the business of lending to businesses. They were just captive funding vehicles for the government.
They really were. But in the 1990s, as part of the market reforms, the SLR was brought down drastically to 25%, and the CRR was reduced to 9.5%.
That is a monumental shift.
It freed up massive amounts of capital. Suddenly, banks had the resources to actually lend to the commercial sector, fueling private enterprise and real economic growth.
So the 1990s reforms liberate the RBI. They finally have their steering wheel back.
They do.
But here's the paradox. Liberalization means the economy is opening up. Foreign capital is suddenly flowing in, financial markets are deregulating and innovating. And the RBI realizes that tracking a single metric broad money, M3, isn't working anymore. The historical relationship between money supply, inflation, and growth was completely breaking down.
That is the inevitable consequence of a maturing financial system. As new financial products emerge and money moves faster and across borders, the velocity of money becomes highly unstable.
So you can't trust the math anymore.
You can no longer rely on a simple equation to tell you how a change in reserve money will impact inflation. The economy became far too complex for a single variable framework.
So what did they do?
The RBI recognized that if a single dial doesn't work, you need to look at the whole dashboard.
Which brings us to the next major evolutionary phase, the multiple indicator approach.
Starting in April 1998.
Right. If the previous era was about staring intensely at the M3 gauge, this era was about installing every single dial, gauge, sensor, and flashing light that money could buy.
The fundamental shift here was philosophical. The RBI officially abandoned the strict monetary targeting framework.
They gave up on just tracking the quantity of money.
Exactly. They moved away from relying solely on quantity variables and started placing a much greater emphasis on rate channels interest rates across different markets. They decided they needed a 360-degree view.
Just to give you an idea of the sheer volume of information they were processing, the sources list the indicators they started tracking simultaneously.
Of a long list?
It is money supply, credit expansion, industrial output, trade deficits, capital flows, the government's fiscal position, rates of return in various financial markets, different metrics of inflation, and exchange rates. They were monitoring absolutely everything.
And it wasn't just historical backward-looking data either.
What else were they looking at?
The RBI recognized that markets move based on expectations. So by the early 2000s, this approach was significantly augmented by forward-looking surveys.
Like polling the market.
Yes. The RBI started conducting regular, detailed surveys on the industrial outlook, credit conditions at banks, capacity utilization in factories, professional forecasters' predictions, and consumer confidence.
They were trying to get a multidimensional, real-time read on the economy's pulse.
Exactly.
And from a purely operational standpoint, there was a massive development during this era. The year is 2000, and the RBI introduces a tool that is still the absolute bedrock of their daily operations today.
Yes. The introduction of the Liquidity Adjustment Facility, or LAF, in 2000.
LAF.
This cannot be overstated. It was a foundational leap forward. The LAF allowed the RBI to manage liquidity on a day-to-day or even intraday basis using repo and reverse repo auctions.
So before this, how did they manage liquidity?
Before the LAF, managing liquidity was clunky and slow. With the LAF, the RBI could finely tune the amount of cash in the banking system every single morning.
And this shift elevated a specific interest rate to the center stage.
It made the weighted average call money rate, the WACR, the new operating target of monetary policy.
WACR. We will dive deeply into the mechanics of the WACR and the LAF shortly, but its introduction in 2000 basically gave the RBI a surgical tool for short-term liquidity management that they never had before.
That's right.
Okay, so let's assess this era. We have the LAF providing surgical operational control. We have forward-looking surveys. We have dozens of indicators capturing every nuance of the economy.
It sounds comprehensive.
On paper, it sounds like an information age utopia. But I have to ask, why did this multiple indicator approach ultimately fail? In the era of big data, isn't having a 360-degree view the ultimate goal?
It sounds ideal until you actually have to make a decision.
What do you mean?
The problem is the signal-to-noise ratio. A dashboard with 20 flashing lights is just as dangerous as a broken speedometer.
Right.
When you are looking at 20 different indicators and 10 are signaling that the economy is overheating and you should raise rates, while the other 10 are pointing toward an industrial slowdown, suggesting you should cut rates, what do?
It's like driving a car where the GPS is telling you to turn left, your passenger is screaming to turn right, the radio says the bridge is out, and the check engine light is on.
Exactly. It's paralysis by analysis. The framework severely blurred the policy intent.
So nobody knew what the RBI actually wanted.
Exactly. When the RBI made a decision, market analysts, banks, and the public were left deeply confused about what the central bank was actually prioritizing at that given moment.
Were they fighting inflation this month?
Yeah.
Or were they boosting exports?
It lacked transparency and predictability.
And from a macroeconomic theory perspective, the sources point out it lacks something very specific: a nominal anchor. Let's unpack that concept because it's vital to understanding what comes next. What is a nominal anchor?
A nominal anchor is a clear, publicly communicated, mathematically defined target that grounds the expectations of everyone in the economy.
How does that work in practice?
Think about it behaviorally. If the public and the financial markets know that the central bank is absolutely legally committed to keeping inflation at, say, 4%, they will alter their behavior.
Because they trust the target.
Exactly. Labor unions will base their wage demands on a 4% expectation. Corporations will base their pricing models on 4%.
It basically creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of stability.
Exactly. It anchors the psychology of the market. The multiple indicator approach had no such anchor.
So people were just guessing.
Yes. People didn't know what the RBI was ultimately targeting, so inflation expectations could easily become unmoored. If a shock hit oil prices, people assumed inflation would skyrocket because they didn't trust the RBI had a singular mandate to stop it.
Which brings us to the realization that the RBI needed a system that was laser-focused, highly transparent, and entirely predictable.
No more arbitrary singular metrics like M3, but no more chaotic dashboards with 20 indicators either.
The central bank needed an anchor. And that realization takes us into the modern era of Indian monetary policy, flexible inflation targeting, or FIT.
This is the prevailing architecture, and understanding its genesis is critical for the exam.
When did this start?
The intellectual groundwork was laid in 2014 by a specialized group formed by the RBI, formerly known as the Expert Committee to Revise and Strengthen the Monetary Policy Framework.
A very important name is attached to this, right? The Urjit Patel Committee.
Yes. The Urjit Patel Committee looked at the confusion of the multiple indicator approach and recommended a formal, uncompromising shift to flexible inflation targeting.
And what was their main argument?
Their core argument was that to be effective in a modern, globalized economy, monetary policy must be completely transparent and predictable. The market should never have to guess what the RBI is trying to achieve.
And this wasn't just a gentleman's agreement or a change in an internal memo. They codified this into the law of the land.
They did.
We mentioned this in the introduction, but let's drill down into the statutory basis of FAT, because this is where the modern mandate gets its teeth.
Right. The May 2016 amendment to the RBI Act dictates the exact mathematical structure of the target. It removes all ambiguity.
Who sets the target?
The target is set by the Government of India in consultation with the RBI, and it is reviewed once every 5 years.
And the specific metric they chose to use is the All India Consumer Price Index, or CPI, inflation.
Yeah, CPI.
Why CPI, as opposed to something like the Wholesale Price Index?
Because CPI is the basket of goods and services that regular consumers actually buy. Food, housing, transport, healthcare.
So it's closer to reality.
It reflects the inflation that the common citizen feels at the grocery store. It is the most direct measure of the cost of living.
And what is the specific numerical target they arrived at?
The mandated target is 4% CPI inflation.
4%?
However, recognizing that the economy is constantly buffeted by unpredictable shock droughts, global oil spikes, supply chain issues, it is a flexible target.
Hence the flexible inflation targeting.
Right. There is an upper tolerance limit of 6% and a lower tolerance limit of 2%.
So 4% is the bullseye you always aim for, but anything between 2 and 6% is considered acceptable operating terrain.
Exactly.
If it drops to 3%, you don't panic, but you might start thinking about cutting rates to spur a little more activity. If it hits 5.5%, you're on high alert, preparing to hike rates.
Exactly. It provides a clear anchor 4%, but with enough breathing room to absorb normal economic volatility without forcing the RBI to react erratically to every minor data blip.
But a target is only as good as the consequences of missing it.
Very true.
What happens if they fail? And what actually constitutes a legal failure? Because inflation can spike for a month just because of a bad onion harvest. That shouldn't trigger a constitutional crisis.
And it doesn't. The law is very precise about the rules of failure. A failure is defined as average inflation breaching the 2 to 6% tolerance band for 3 consecutive quarters.
3 consecutive quarters. That is 9 straight months of inflation running persistently too hot or too cold.
Right.
That proves it's not just a bad harvest, it's a systemic failure of monetary policy. And if that happens, the RBI is quite literally in the hot seat.
Yes, the accountability mechanism is unprecedented. If the RBI fails to keep inflation within the band for 3 consecutive quarters, they are legally required to draft a formal report and send it to the central government.
This isn't just a polite apology letter, is it? The statute demands specific answers.
It demands an action plan. The report must explicitly detail 3 things. First, the objective reasons for the failure.
Okay.
Second, the specific remedial actions proposed by the RBI to bring inflation back under control. And third, a firm estimate of the time period within which the inflation target will be achieved again.
It is a massive accountability mechanism, and it isn't just theoretical.
Yeah.
We actually saw this mechanism triggered very recently, setting a major historical precedent.
Indeed, we saw it in November 2022.
Post-COVID.
Exactly. Following the massive global supply chain disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, immediately followed by the geopolitical shocks in Europe, which sent energy and commodity prices soaring, inflation surged globally. India was not immune.
So they missed the target.
Despite the RBI's efforts, average domestic CPI inflation exceeded the 6% upper tolerance threshold for 3 successive quarters.
So for the first and only time so far in the history of the FIT framework, the RBI had to draft that failure report and send it to the government.
Yes, they did.
While nobody wants high inflation, the fact that this happened actually proved that the system works exactly as designed.
That's a good point.
When things go persistently off track, there is mandatory, transparent, and public accountability.
It reinforced the credibility of the framework. The market saw that the RBI couldn't just sweep a miss under the rug. They had to own it and outline the cure.
Now, we know the target, and we know the consequences of failure. But who actually makes the decisions?
Who is steering the ship?
Exactly. Who is sitting in the room deciding whether interest rates need to go up to fight inflation or down to support growth? Under the old system, this massive responsibility essentially rested entirely on the shoulders of one individual, the RBI governor.
Which is an incredible amount of pressure and, frankly, a structural vulnerability.
Yeah.
You want diverse perspectives when making decisions that impact a trillion-dollar economy. So the 2016 amendment democratized this process by creating the Monetary Policy Committee, or the MPC.
I always think of the MPC like a Supreme Court of economics. But designing a committee like this is tricky.
Very tricky.
You don't want the government appointing all the members, because then monetary policy just becomes a tool for politicians to boost the economy right before an election.
Yes, that would compromise independence.
But you also don't want the central bank operating in a total vacuum, completely detached from the elected government.
Yeah.
How are the seats divided to ensure balance?
It's a carefully calibrated tribunal of 6 members, split exactly down the middle to prevent groupthink. 3 members are internal to the RBI, and 3 are external experts.
Let's clearly identify the structure. For the exam takers, the 3 internal RBI members are
The governor of the RBI, who acts as the ex officio chairperson of the committee, the deputy governor of the RBI in charge of monetary policy, and 1 officer of the RBI nominated by the central board. These 3 bring the immense institutional knowledge, the real-time data, and the operational expertise of the central bank.
And to counterbalance them, we have the three external members.
Yes, they are appointed by the central government. The statute requires them to be persons of ability, integrity, and standing with knowledge and experience in the field of economics, banking, finance, or monetary policy.
So no random politicians.
No, these are typically eminent academic economists or financial market experts. They bring outside perspectives, fresh theoretical models, and a vital independence from the internal bureaucracy of the RBI.
So it is three insiders versus three outsiders, a perfect balance. But that naturally begs the question, what happens in a 3-3 deadlock?
Ah, the tiebreaker.
If they are voting on whether to raise interest rates, and they are split right down the middle, how is the tie broken?
Each of the 6 members has 1 vote. But in the event of an equality of votes, the governor of the RBI has a second, or casting vote, to break the tie.
That's interesting.
This ensures that a decision is always reached, and it ultimately leaves the final directional authority with the head of the institution.
That is a crucial structural detail. Now let's talk about the operational rhythm of this committee. How often do they meet, and how does the public know what they are doing? Because transparency is the whole point of FIT.
The statute requires the MPC to meet at least 4 times a year. However, in practice, they typically follow a bi-monthly cycle, meaning they meet 6 times a year.
Okay, bi-monthly.
And their transparency mandate is incredibly strict. They cannot operate in the shadows. Immediately after every meeting concludes, they must publish a resolution detailing their decision on the policy repo rate and the overarching rationale behind their stance.
But the real insight comes 2 weeks later.
Yes. On the 14th day after the meeting, the RBI is legally required to publish the detailed minutes of the meeting.
The minutes are fascinating. Why a 14-day delay? Why not release them immediately? Or conversely, wait a year like some historical central bank archives?
The 14-day delay is a behavioral sweet spot. If you release the minutes instantly, you might create massive, erratic market volatility as traders overreact to every single dissenting comment.
That makes sense.
But if you wait too long, the information is stale and useless for anchoring current expectations. 14 days allows the immediate market reaction to the headline rate decision to settle, while still providing timely transparency into the committee's thinking.
And what exactly is in these minutes? It's not just a summary of what was discussed, is it?
No, it is remarkably detailed. The minutes reveal the individual voting record of each member, who voted for a hike, who voted for a pause.
Wow.
More critically, it contains a written statement from each of the 6 members explicitly explaining the economic rationale for why they voted the way they did.
That is incredible accountability. You get to see the internal debate. You get to see if one external member is consistently worried about inflation, while another is consistently worried about growth.
Exactly. It allows the market to deeply understand the reaction function of the committee.
And beyond the bi-monthly minutes, the RBI is also mandated to publish a larger, more comprehensive document twice a year.
Yes. The Monetary Policy Report, or MPR, published once every 6 months, this document is a deep dive into the macroeconomic health of the country.
What's in it?
It explains the sources of recent inflation and, crucially, provides the RBI's formal forecast of inflation for the next 6 to 18 months. It is their entire macroeconomic roadmap laid bare for the public to scrutinize.
Okay, so that covers the who, the what, and the why. We have the 6-member MPC aiming for a 4% inflation target, operating with immense transparency.
The whole architecture.
But setting a target is one thing. Actually hitting it in a chaotic global economy is another. The MPC could declare the rate should be 6.5%, but someone actually has to make that a reality in the financial markets.
Right.
This brings us to the operational mechanics. We need to open up the RBI's toolbox.
Let's do it. The MPC sets the target rate, but the Financial Markets Operations Department of the RBI actually has to steer the massive ship of the Indian economy to hit that target. And they do that by manipulating the supply of liquidity, the sheer amount of cash in the banking system on a daily basis.
Before we detail the specific tools, we need to define the compass heading for the trading desk. Inflation is the ultimate macroeconomic goal, but what is the day-to-day, hour-to-hour operating target that the RBI traders are staring at on their screens?
The operating target is the WACR, the weighted average call rate.
We mentioned that earlier. Let's explain what that is.
Banks constantly have fluctuations in their cash reserves. One bank might have a massive influx of corporate deposits today, while another bank might have a massive outflow as clients pay their taxes.
So they are uneven.
Exactly. To balance this out, banks lend money to each other overnight, without collateral, in what is called the call money market. The interest rate on these overnight loans fluctuates based on supply and demand.
So if the banking system as a whole is short on cash, banks will charge each other higher interest rates to lend what little cash they have.
Correct. The WACR is the volume-weighted average of all those thousands of overnight interest rates. It is the purest measure of the cost of money in the economy on any given day.
And what does the RBI do with it?
The RBI's entire daily operational mission is to keep this WACR tightly aligned with the policy repo rate set by the MPC.
So if the MPC says the policy repo rate is 6.5%, the RBI's trading desk watches the WACR. If they see the WACR drifting up to 6.7% because banks are short on cash, the RBI has to step in and inject cash to bring it back down to 6.5%.
Yes.
If the WACR drops to 6.3% because there's too much cash sloshing around, the RBI has to suck that cash out.
Precisely. And to keep the WACR from flying completely out of control while they make these adjustments, they operate within a framework called the Liquidity Adjustment Facility, or the LAF corridor.
Let's use an analogy here to visualize this.
Yeah.
I always compare the LAF corridor to the bumpers in a bowling alley.
Oh, that's a good one.
The WACR is your bowling ball. The RBI wants that ball to roll perfectly down the dead center of the lane, right over the policy repo rate. But financial markets are messy, and the ball inevitably drifts.
Right.
If it drifts too far to the left or the right, it hits the bumpers and gets pushed back toward the center. The corridor keeps the ball out of the gutters.
That is an excellent visual framework. Let's define the center of the lane and the two bumpers. The center of the lane, the benchmark, is the policy repo rate.
Repo stands for a repurchase agreement. What exactly happens in a repo transaction?
It is a collateralized loan. If a bank needs overnight liquidity, they can go to the RBI. The RBI will lend them cash at the fixed policy repo rate, but the bank must provide government securities as collateral.
And the repurchase part?
They agree to repurchase those securities the next day, returning the cash plus the repo interest. That is the center of the lane.
Okay, so repo is the center. Now let's look at the floor. The left bumper of our bowling alley. What stops the WACR from dropping to zero if banks are completely floated with cash?
The floor is the standing deposit facility, or SDF. This rate is structurally placed exactly 25 basis points. That's a quarter of a percentage point below the policy repo rate.
So if the repo is 6.5%, the SDF is 6.25%.
Exactly. If banks are swimming in excess cash and cannot find anyone to lend it to in the interbank market at a decent rate, they can always park those funds overnight with the RBI at the SDF rate.
It creates a hard floor. No rational bank will lend money to another bank at 6.1% if they can get a guaranteed, risk-free 6.25% from the central bank.
Exactly. Now, there is a historical nuance here that is absolutely foundational to understanding modern Indian monetary policy.
What's that?
The SDF replaced the old fixed-rate reverse repo system, but there is a massive fundamental difference in how it operates.
Let's put this in neon lights for the exam takers.
Sure.
What is the fundamental difference between the old reverse repo and the new SDF?
The SDF requires no collateral from the RBI.
None at all.
None. When a bank deposits money into the SDF, the RBI simply takes the cash and pays the interest. They do not hand over government securities to the bank in return.
Let's pause and explain why that seemingly minor technical detail is actually a massive structural breakthrough. Why was collateral a problem under the old system?
Under the old reverse repo system, whenever the RBI wanted to absorb cash from the banks, it was legally required to give those banks government securities as collateral.
Right.
In normal economic times, that is fine. The RBI has a massive portfolio of government bonds. But imagine an extreme scenario. Think back to demonetization in 2016.
Oh, wow. When 86% of the country's currency was suddenly deposited into the banking system within a matter of weeks.
Exactly.
They were hitting the physical limits of their own balance sheet. They were going to run out of ammunition to fight the liquidity glut.
Precisely. The legal requirement to provide collateral became a massive constraint on their ability to manage liquidity.
So that's why SDF was created.
Yes. The SDF, which had actually been recommended years earlier by the Urjit Patel Committee, was the ultimate solution. The government amended the RBI Act to allow it.
It untethered them.
By allowing the RBI to absorb unlimited liquidity without providing collateral, it untethered their liquidity management capabilities from the size of their government security holdings. It is an incredibly powerful, unconstrained tool.
Wow. Okay, so that is the SDF floor, 25 basis points below repo, entirely collateral-free. Now, what about the right bumper, the ceiling? What stops the WACR from spiking to 15% if there is a sudden cash crunch?
The ceiling of our corridor is the marginal standing facility, or MSF. This rate is placed exactly 25 basis points above the repo rate.
So if repo is 6.5%, MSF is 6.75%.
Correct. It acts as a vital safety valve for banks facing acute, unanticipated liquidity shortages at the end of the day.
But wait, I have a logical question here. If a bank desperately needs money, why don't they just borrow it at the normal, cheaper repo rate of 6.5%? Why would they ever choose to pay the higher MSF penal rate?
Because of the rules regarding collateral. To borrow at the normal repo window, a bank must provide unencumbered collateral.
Unencumbered, meaning?
That means they must have government securities that they own free and clear, over and above their mandatory regulatory requirements.
Ah. And what if a bank has used up all its free and clear securities?
That is exactly when they hit the panic button and turn to the MSF. The MSF facility allows a bank to dip into its statutory liquidity ratio, its SLR portfolio, to borrow from the RBI.
Let's define SLR again for clarity.
SLR is the mandatory stash of safe liquid assets, mostly government bonds, that the government forces banks to hold at all times. It's their rainy day fund to ensure solvency.
So it's basically off limits normally.
Yes. Normally, touching the SLR portfolio to borrow money is strictly forbidden.
But MSF provides an emergency exception.
Mm-hmm.
The RBI is essentially saying, okay, we see you are in a severe liquidity bind. We will allow you to dip into your sacred SLR rainy day fund up to a predefined limit, currently 2% of your deposit, so you don't default.
Right.
But because you are breaking the normal regulatory rules, we are going to charge you a penal interest rate for the privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And that penal rate is the MSF rate, 25 basis points above repo.
That is exactly how the plumbing works. So through this elegant design, the WACR, the bowling ball, is naturally constrained. It bounces between the MSF ceiling, where banks borrow in emergencies, and the SDF floor, where banks park excess cash.
Ideally hovering right around the central policy repo rate.
Ideally, yes.
Okay, that covers the LAF corridor, which handles day-to-day transient liquidity fluctuations. But the RBI has other tools for different types of problems. Let's delve into the rest of the toolkit. Let's start with an old historical tool that still has a specific modern function: the bank rate.
Historically, going back decades, the bank rate was the primary tool of monetary policy. It was the rate at which the RBI would buy or rediscount commercial bills of exchange.
But not anymore.
No, as financial markets evolved, that function became largely obsolete.
So what does the bank rate do today? Why is it still on the books?
Today, it primarily acts as a penal rate. If a commercial bank fails to maintain its mandatory reserve requirements, if they fall short on their CRR or SLR obligations, the RBI charges them a penalty based on the bank rate.
So it's just a punishment rate.
Essentially. And operationally, to keep things simple, the RBI has permanently aligned the bank rate with the MSF rate. If the MPC raises the MSF rate by 25 basis points, the bank rate automatically goes up by the same amount.
You just mentioned CRR again. We touched on it earlier during the 1990s reforms, but let's give a robust mechanical definition of both CRR and SLR. Let's start with CRR, the cash reserve ratio.
CRR is the percentage of a bank's total net demand and time liabilities, essentially their total deposits, that they are legally required to keep as pure, unencumbered cash balances with the RBI.
So if a bank has 100 rupees in deposits and the CRR is 4.5%, they have to take 4.5 rupees in physical cash and lock it in a vault at the RBI.
Yes.
And crucially, they earn absolutely zero interest on that money, right?
Correct. It is a direct, blunt liquidity lever. If the RBI wants to instantly suck massive amounts of cash out of the banking system to fight inflation, they just raise the CRR to 5%.
Instantly, billions of rupees are frozen.
And conversely, if they want to stimulate the economy, they lower the CRR, instantly releasing billions of rupees back to the banks to lend out.
And SLR, the statutory liquidity ratio, works similarly, but instead of cash, it involves assets.
Right. SLR is the percentage of deposits banks must invest in safe, highly liquid assets. While cash and gold qualify, in practice, banks fulfill their SLR obligations almost entirely by buying central and state government securities.
So it's a stability buffer.
Exactly. It ensures that banks always have a massive buffer of risk-free assets to liquidate in case there is a run on the bank.
Okay, so CRR and SLR are blunt regulatory ratios. What if the RBI wants to permanently inject or absorb liquidity without changing the fundamental rules for all banks? This brings us to WELMOs, open market operations.
While the LAF corridor manages overnight, transient liquidity, OMOs are used for managing durable, long-term liquidity.
How so?
If the RBI determines that the economy structurally needs more money over the next year to support growth, they conduct outright purchases of government securities from the secondary market. They buy bonds and they pay for them by injecting permanent new cash into the banking system.
And if they want to permanently absorb money to fight long-term inflation, they do the opposite.
Yes.
They sell government securities from their own portfolio, sucking cash out of the market. It is a permanent transaction,
Yeah.
unlike a repo, which reverses the next day.
Exactly. But this brings up a unique challenge. What if the RBI faces a scenario where there is a massive, enduring surplus of liquidity in the economy, say because of a flood of foreign direct investment, but the RBI doesn't want to sell off its own portfolio of government bonds to absorb it?
Because if they sell too many of their own bonds, they might run out of ammunition for future OMOs or emergency repo operations. So how do they permanently absorb cash without depleting their own balance sheet?
They use a specialized tool created in 2004 called the Market Stabilization Scheme, or MSS.
How does MSS differ from a normal FOMO sale?
In an MSS operation, the central government actually issues special short-dated treasury bills or cash management bills specifically at the request of the RBI.
The government issues them.
Yes. The sole purpose of these bills is to mop up excess liquidity from the market.
Wait, if the government is issuing bills, aren't they just borrowing money to spend it? Doesn't that defeat the purpose of absorbing liquidity?
That is the genius of the MSS. The cash raised by selling these specific MSS bills is not handed over to the government to spend on roads or salaries.
Where does it go?
The cash is placed in a separate, sequestered account at the RBI. It is entirely sterilized. It exists purely to pull money out of the economy, solving the liquidity problem without touching the RBI's core bond portfolio.
That is a brilliant piece of institutional architecture. The final tool in our standard toolkit is related to the foreign exchange market, Forex swaps.
This is another tool for managing durable liquidity, but it leverages the foreign exchange reserves. The RBI can conduct a sell-buy or buy-sell U.S. dollar swap auction with commercial banks.
Walk us through a hypothetical transaction. Let's say foreign investment is pouring into Indian tech startups. Dollars are flooding in, being converted to rupees, which creates excess rupee liquidity that might cause inflation.
Right, a classic problem.
The RBI wants to absorb that excess rupee liquidity. What do?
The RBI would initiate a sell-buy swap. They sell U.S. dollars from their massive Forex reserves to the commercial banks today and simultaneously agree to buy those same dollars back at a predetermined forward rate, say, 3 years from now.
By selling the dollars to the banks today, the banks have to pay the RBI in rupees. So the RBI successfully sucks the excess rupees out of the domestic system, sterilizing the inflow. And 3 years from now, the transaction reverses. It is a powerful way to impact domestic liquidity while simultaneously managing the currency exchange rate.
Okay, take a deep breath. We have covered an immense amount of ground.
We really have. We have the LEF corridor, SDF, MSF, CRR, SLR, OMOs, MSS, and Forex swaps. That is the standard everyday toolkit of a central bank.
But standard tools work for standard times.
Right. What happens when the world fundamentally breaks? What happens when a generational crisis hits? Something so massive and terrifying that adjusting the repo rate by 0.25% is like trying to put out a raging forest fire with a squirt gun.
That brings us to the realm of extreme situations and the deployment of unconventional monetary policy tools, or UMPTs.
Let's set the scene to understand the necessity of these tools. March 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic hits. The global economy doesn't just slow down, it functionally ceases to operate.
It was unprecedented. Lockdowns are imposed, supply chains freeze, and financial markets stare into the abyss of a depression.
In a catastrophic crisis like that, central banks face two massive problems. First, fear takes over the market. Even if the central bank cuts the repo rate drastically to make borrowing cheap, commercial banks are too terrified of defaults to actually lend the money out to struggling businesses.
Exactly. The transmission mechanism breaks.
And the second problem is the mathematical limit of standard tools.
Yes, the zero lower bound. A central bank can only cut the policy interest rate so much. Once you approach zero, you can't really cut much further without completely destabilizing the banking system's business model.
So what do?
Well, the economy is still collapsing and needs massive support. When you run out of room on the interest rate dial, you have to find another way to act. You have to alter the size, the composition, and the risk profile of the central bank's own balance sheet.
Enter the unconventional toolkit. Let's talk about the RBI's specific liquidity support operations during the pandemic. The two massive acronyms here are LTROs and TLTROs.
Let's start with LTROs. Long-term repo operations, which the RBI introduced in February 2020, just as the crisis was beginning to loom.
Right.
We established earlier that normal repo operations are short-term overnight, or maybe 14 days. With LTROs, the RBI provided commercial banks with massive amounts of liquidity for terms of 1 to 3 years.
Oh, that's a long time.
But here's the kicker. They provided this long-term money at the prevailing short-term policy repo rate.
So they gave banks long-term, stable funding at incredibly cheap short-term prices.
Exactly. It was designed to give banks immense confidence. If a bank knows it has cheap funding locked in for 3 years, it is much more likely to lower its own lending rates and extend credit to businesses, rather than hoarding cash out of fear.
But pouring water at the top of the hill doesn't mean it reaches the dying plants at the bottom. The RBI quickly realized that just giving banks cheap money didn't mean the money was going where it was needed most.
Right. Banks, still fearful of defaults, were either hoarding the cash or only lending to massive, ultra-safe corporations.
And the small businesses and the shadow banking sector were still starving for credit.
Which forced the RBI to iterate and introduce TLTROs, targeted long-term repo operations. The word targeted is the key.
How did they force the targeting?
The RBI provided the cheap long-term money through TLTROs, but they attached a strict, non-negotiable condition.
Which was?
The banks had to deploy those specific funds into stressed sectors of the economy. Banks were mandated to buy investment-grade corporate bonds, commercial papers, and non-convertible debentures of specific entities.
So they forced their hand.
Eventually, the RBI explicitly directed these funds toward non-banking financial companies, NBFCs, and microfinance institutions.
It was a brilliant way to bypass the bank's risk aversion. The RBI said, "We will give you this incredibly cheap money, but you cannot just sit on it. You must inject it directly into the parched corners of the credit market that are keeping the grassroots economy alive."
They further reinforced this grassroots support through sector-specific refinance facilities.
What are those?
The RBI provided special, massive credit lines directly to all India financial institutions' AIFIs. This included institutions like NABARD for agriculture, SADB for small industries, and the National Housing Bank.
So completely bypassing commercial banks.
Exactly. This ensured that credit kept flowing to farmers, small factory owners, and home buyers, completely bypassing the bottlenecks in the commercial banking sector.
Okay, those are the liquidity tools. But here is one of my absolute favorite unconventional tools, partly because the name sounds like a 1960s dance craze.
Operation Twist.
Operation Twist, yes.
For the listener who doesn't have a PhD in finance, we need to do a deep mechanical breakdown of Operation Twist. What exactly is twisting, and how does it actually lower borrowing costs for a company trying to build a factory?
To understand Operation Twist, we first have to understand the yield curve. The yield curve is simply a line on a graph showing the interest rates or yields of government bonds across different time horizons, from a 3-month Treasury bill to a 10-year government bond. Normally, that curve slopes upward. Short-term loans have lower interest rates because there is less risk.
Right.
If I lend you money for a month, I'm pretty sure you'll pay me back. But if I lend you money for 10 years, I face the risk of inflation eating away my returns or a massive economic collapse. So I demand a higher interest rate for a 10-year loan to compensate for that risk.
Exactly. Now, in a severe economic crisis, the central bank wants to stimulate long-term investment. They want corporations to borrow money to build infrastructure, buy machinery, and hire workers for long-term projects.
Because that creates jobs.
But corporations borrow money based on long-term interest rates. If the 10-year bond yield is too high, borrowing is too expensive, and the corporations will cancel their projects.
So the RBI needs to bring the long end of the yield curve down. They need to lower long-term interest rates. But why not just print massive amounts of new money and buy up all the long-term bonds to drive the rates down?
Because printing that much new money would dramatically expand the central bank's balance sheet, flood the system with permanent liquidity, and risk triggering massive inflation once the crisis passes.
The tightrope again.
They need to lower long-term rates without injecting net new money into the system.
How is that mathematically possible?
Through the twist. The RBI simultaneously buys long-term government securities and sells an equal amount of short-term government securities from its own portfolio.
Let's walk through the bond math here, because the inverse relationship between bond prices and yields is the secret to this whole operation.
Correct. When the RBI steps into the market and buys billions of rupees worth of 10-year bonds, they create massive artificial demand for those long-term bonds. Basic economics tells us that when demand goes up, the price of the bond goes up.
And here's the crucial mechanic. When the price of a bond goes up, its interest yield goes down. If a bond pays a fixed 5 rupees a year, and you buy the bond for 100 rupees, your yield is 5%. But if the RBI drives the price of that bond up to 200 rupees, that fixed 5 rupee payout now only represents a 2.5% yield.
Precisely. By aggressively buying the long-term bonds, the RBI drives their prices up and their yields down. This makes long-term borrowing cheaper across the entire economy, stimulating investment.
But what about the other half of the transaction, the short-term bonds?
Simultaneously, the RBI sells massive amounts of short-term bonds. This floods the market with supply, driving the price of short-term bonds down, which forces their short-term yields up.
So the long end of the curve comes down and the short end of the curve goes up. The yield curve physically flattens, it twists.
Yes.
And because the amount of money spent buying the long bonds exactly equals the amount of money earned selling the short bonds, the overall size of the RBI's balance sheet hasn't changed by a single rupee. It is a stunning piece of financial engineering.
It achieves the macroeconomic goal without creating long-term inflationary risks. The final unconventional tool we must discuss is less about financial engineering and more about behavioral psychology. Forward guidance.
This sounds like public relations. How is talking to the market a monetary policy tool?
Because financial markets do not operate on the present. They operate on expectations of the future.
Okay.
The interest rate a bank charges for a 5-year loan today isn't just based on today's repo rate. It's based on what the bank thinks the RBI will do to the repo rate over the next 5 years.
So if the market suddenly fears the RBI will panic and hike rates tomorrow, borrowing costs in the real economy will shoot up today, instantly strangling the economic recovery.
So forward guidance is the central bank stepping up to the microphone and making a highly credible commitment about its future policy path, specifically to calm those fears and anchor market expectations.
Yes, and the sources divide this guidance into 2 distinct types, time contingent and state contingent.
Let's define them. Time contingent seems fairly obvious.
Time contingent guidance ties the central bank's commitment to a specific calendar date. For example, the RBI might state, "We will keep the policy repo rate at its current historic low for the entirety of the next financial year."
This gives markets absolute certainty for a defined period.
But what if the economy suddenly recovers much faster than expected halfway through the year? The RBI is trapped by their calendar promise.
Which is why central banks often prefer state contingent guidance. This ties the commitment not to a calendar, but to specific economic conditions.
Like what?
During the depths of the COVID crisis, the RBI used this aggressively. Their guidance was essentially, we will maintain an accommodative stance for as long as it is necessary to revive growth on a durable basis and mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the economy.
That is powerful. It tells the market, do not panic. We are not going to pull the rug out from under this fragile recovery just because we see one positive month of data. We are going to stay low until a fire is truly out.
It shapes the psychology of every lender and borrower in the nation.
Okay, so we have covered the overarching target of flexible inflation targeting. We've covered the daily tools of the LAF corridor, and we've covered the dramatic crisis tools like Operation Twist.
It's a lot.
But this brings us to the final and arguably most important section of our deep dive, the ultimate test of the entire framework, monetary policy transmission.
This is where the theoretical rubber meets the actual road. Because the RBI can sit in their tower in Mumbai holding brilliant committee meetings, twisting yield curves, and tweaking repo rates by 25 basis points all day long.
But none of it matters. Literally none of it. If the local bank branch in a small town doesn't actually change the interest rate they charge a small business owner for a working capital loan or a family for a home mortgage.
If the policy does not transmit from the central bank through the commercial barking system and into the real economy, the central bank is just pushing on a string.
Let's break down exactly how this transmission occurs. Economic theory identifies 5 main channels through which a central bank's actions ripple through the economy. We need to define all of them. Let's start with the most intuitive one.
The first and most crucial for India is the interest rate channel. This is the direct path. The RBI cuts the repo rate, lowering the cost of funds for commercial banks.
And the banks pass those savings on by lowering their lending rates.
Cheaper loans mean consumers buy more cars and homes, and businesses invest in more factories, stimulating the economy.
The second is the credit channel. This is slightly different than just the price of the loan.
Yes, the credit channel is about the availability of loans. When the RBI tightens policy and raises rates or increases the CRR, they drain liquidity from the system. Banks literally have less cash to lend.
So even if a borrower is willing to pay a higher interest rate, the bank might just say no because they need to preserve their own capital.
Exactly. The sheer volume of credit shrinks, slowing the economy down.
The third is the exchange rate channel. This links domestic monetary policy to international trade.
If the RBI raises interest rates significantly higher than rates in the US or Europe, foreign investors will flood money into Indian bonds to get those higher returns. This massive inflow of foreign capital increases the demand for rupees. The rupee appreciates, becoming stronger.
Which sounds good, but it has a massive side effect.
Right. A strong rupee makes Indian exports much more expensive for foreign buyers, hurting domestic manufacturers. However, it makes importing oil and electronics cheaper, which helps bring domestic inflation down.
It's a complex balancing act of trade competitiveness versus imported inflation.
The fourth is the asset price channel.
How does that one work?
When the RBI cuts interest rates, keeping money in a bank's savings account yields terrible returns. So investors take their money out of the bank and buy riskier assets like stocks or real estate, driving those asset prices up.
Which makes people feel richer.
Exactly. This creates a wealth effect. People see their stock portfolios or house values rising, they feel wealthier, and so they go out and spend more money in the real economy.
And the final channel is the expectations channel, which we touched on with forward guidance. If the RBI aggressively hikes rates, it signals to the public that the central bank is serious about crushing inflation.
Right. People believe inflation will drop, so workers demand smaller wage increases and companies halt price hikes. The expectation of lower inflation actually causes lower inflation.
Now, while all 5 channels operate simultaneously, empirical evidence shows that in India, because the financial system is so heavily dominated by traditional commercial banks rather than massive bond markets, the interest rate channel is by far the strongest and most critical path for transmission.
Absolutely.
But transmission is not instantaneous. It doesn't happen overnight. There are specific lag times. What are the timelines we need to understand for the exam?
Monetary policy is inherently forward-looking because of these lags. The data suggests that if the RBI changes the repo rate today, the impact on economic output, real GDP growth, is felt with a lag of 2 to 3 quarters.
So 6 to 9 months just to see the growth impact. And what about the primary target, inflation?
The peak impact on inflation takes even longer. It takes 3 to 4 quarters, nearly a full year, for a rate change today to fully suppress or stimulate price levels.
Wow.
And the overall trailing impact of that single policy change can persist in the economy for 8 to 12 quarters.
That perfectly explains why the RBI uses forward-looking surveys and publishes 18-month inflation forecasts. They're essentially aiming at a moving target that is a year away in the future.
Exactly.
But historically, there was a massive structural friction in India's interest rate channel. The plumbing was fundamentally broken.
It was. The transmission was painfully slow, and worse, it was deeply asymmetrical.
What does asymmetrical mean in this context?
It means banks reacted differently depending on which direction the RBI moved. Historically, when the RBI raised the repo rate to fight inflation, commercial banks were incredibly quick to raise their own lending rates for consumers.
They instantly passed the higher costs on to borrowers.
But when the economy was struggling and the RBI cut the repo rate to provide stimulus, banks dragged their feet. They were painfully slow, sometimes taking months or years to pass those rate cuts on to the public.
Which completely defeated the entire purpose of the RBI's rate cuts. The RBI was trying to stimulate the economy, but the banks were acting like a dam, blocking the flow of cheap credit. Why were commercial banks able to do this?
Because of the opaque way they were allowed to price their loans. For decades, banks used internal benchmarking systems to determine lending rates. Systems like the base rate, or later, the marginal cost of funds-based lending rate, MCLR.
The key word there is internal.
Exactly. Because these benchmark rates were calculated based on a complex formula utilizing the bank's own internal operating costs and deposit rates, the banks had immense discretionary power.
They could manipulate it.
They could essentially tweak the internal math to absorb the RBI's repo rate cuts, using the cheaper central bank money to pad their own profit margins, rather than lowering the final rate for the consumer.
Here is an analogy. Internal benchmarking is like allowing a student to grade their own final exam. Of course, they're going to use every subjective loophole to give themselves an A.
The perfect analogy.
If the RBI says make loans cheaper, the bank looks at its opaque internal formula and says, well, according to our unique calculation of our operational costs, we simply can't lower the rate right now. It was a black box.
It completely lacked transparency, and it broke the monetary transmission chain. The central bank recognized that asking nicely wasn't working, so they decided to take away the grading pen.
They implemented a massive structural regulatory mandate, external benchmarking.
If internal benchmarking is grading your own homework, external benchmarking is like taking a standardized state test. You don't grade it. An independent, unalterable authority grades it.
Let's break down this mandate, because it revolutionized Indian banking.
Effective October 1st, 2019, the RBI issued a mandate that changed everything. All scheduled commercial banks were required to link all new floating rate personal loans, retail loans like home and auto loans, and loans to micro and small enterprises to an external benchmark.
And then they expanded it.
By April 1st, 2020, they extended this mandate to include loans to medium enterprises as well.
So the banks could no longer use their own internal formulas. What were the external benchmarks they were legally allowed to link to?
The RBI gave them a menu of specific, transparent, market-determined rates. They could link their loan rates directly to the RBI's policy repo rate, or the yield on 3-month Treasury bills, or the 6-month Treasury bills.
Or any other benchmark published by FBL, right?
Exactly. Any benchmark market interest rate officially published by Financial Benchmarks India Private Ltd.
Notice what all those options have in common. The commercial bank has absolutely zero control over them. They're external, publicly visible numbers. What was the result of this mandate?
It drastically and permanently improved both the speed and the transparency of monetary transmission. The change was profound.
Give us an example.
Now, if the MPC meets on a Wednesday and cuts the repo rate by 50 basis points, a consumer's home loan that is linked to the repo rate automatically resets lower at the next scheduled interval, exactly as written in the contract.
The bank cannot hide behind opaque internal calculations. The savings are passed on immediately. The monetary policy translates directly, forcefully, and predictably into the real economy.
It essentially fixed the plumbing of the financial system. It ensured that when the central bank adjusts the tension on the tightrope, those adjustments actually reach the ground level of the economy instantly.
That is a phenomenal place to bring this incredibly deep dive to a close. We have covered an immense expanse of economic history, theory, and operational mechanics today. Let's do a rapid-fire summary to lock these concepts in.
We began by tracing the evolution from the rigid, administered direct controls of the pre-1985 era to the Chakravarti Committee's monetary targeting framework.
We saw how that mathematical attempt to control broad money, M3, ultimately collapsed under the sheer weight of fiscal dominance and the automatic monetization of government debt through ad hoc treasury bills.
Then we explored the massive structural reforms of the 1990s, the phasing out of those ad hoc bills and the freeing up of bank capital through lowered SLR and CRR requirements.
This paved the way for the multiple indicator approach in 1998, which gave the RBI a 360-degree dashboard, but ultimately failed because it lacked a clear, predictable nominal anchor.
Which logically led to the Urjit Patel Committee's recommendations, culminating in the historic 2016 statutory mandate for flexible inflation targeting.
We now have a legally binding 4% inflation target with a plus or minus 2% tolerance band overseen by the transparent 6-member Monetary Policy Committee.
We dove deep into the operational toolkit. We learned that the WACR is the daily operating target, bouncing like a bowling ball down the LAF corridor.
It is bounded by the MSF ceiling for emergencies and the brilliant collateral-free SDF floor. We explored crisis management through unconventional tools like Operation Twist flattening the yield curve and TLTROs forcing liquidity to the grassroots.
And finally, we examined the mechanics of monetary transmission, seeing how the RBI mandated external benchmarking to finally force commercial banks to pass rate changes transparently and rapidly onto the public, fixing the critical interest rate channel.
It is a remarkable evolution of institutional capability. The RBI has transformed from a passive manager of government debt into a highly sophisticated, independent architect of macroeconomic stability.
It's a completely different institution now.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've discussed today, but looks toward the future.
We've seen how effectively the external benchmarking mandate forced traditional commercial banks to fall in line and transmit policy. But the financial world is changing faster than ever.
It is.
As the Indian economy becomes increasingly digital and decentralized, we are seeing the rise of massive fintech platforms, non-bank shadow lenders, peer-to-peer lending, and the looming potential of central bank digital currencies.
These innovations are fundamentally blurring the lines of what constitutes a bank and what constitutes money.
So, a brilliant provocative question to ponder. As commercial banks slowly become a smaller piece of the overall credit pie, how will the RBI's traditional transmission channels hold up?
If a massive portion of the population is getting credit through digital algorithms and decentralized platforms, will tweaking the repo rate up or down by 25 basis points still have the same overwhelming power to steer the macroeconomic ship? Or will the RBI have to invent an entirely new digital toolkit for the next century?
It is the next great frontier for monetary policy, and whoever solves it will define the next era of economic history.
Something to keep you thinking long after this audio finishes. To everyone listening, especially those of you utilizing this deep dive to prepare for your promotional exams, we wish you the absolute best of luck. You are now armed with every nuance, every mechanism, and the deep historical context of the RBI's monetary framework. You understand not just the what, but the how and the why. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.